Well, good morning and welcome back to another video about POLS 1000 for the spring 2020 here at St. Louis University. Today we're going to be talking about what I think is a pretty exciting topic. I hope you'll agree. Chapter 10 in our textbook Analyzing Politics considers the different branches of government and their relationships. I think this is an exciting topic because most of us, certainly most people in the United States and Western Europe, just assume, take for granted that governments are separated into branches. But how and why? And are there other configurations of how those branches are related in other countries? And the answer is yes, there are all kinds of variations. So without any further ado, let's jump into the PowerPoint slide to talk about the main themes of this chapter. So I am just going to set that up. All right, you should be able to see the first screen of the PowerPoint, Chapter 10, Comparative Politics and Three Branches of Government. So this chapter, as you know, is a continuation of our discussion of comparative politics. So if you don't remember what comparative politics is, it might be good to pause the video and refresh your memory through your notes or the textbook. But we'll be talking about the three branches of government, particularly in this chapter. So the overall theme of this chapter is this first topic, the branches of government. And the three branches are executive, legislative, and the judicial. And the executive and legislative branches tend to be certainly two of the most important of the three, if not the two most. And their relations are some of the most complex in governments. So the bulk of the chapter concerns relations between those two branches. So the second topic is that question. Then the third and fourth topics are two case studies. So we'll look at the United States and we'll look at the United Kingdom. So if you don't know, Great Britain is part of the United Kingdom, and so the adjective for the UK, the United Kingdom, is often British. And then we'll attend to the often neglected judiciary in these conversations. So just very briefly, the branches of government in many countries are separated. The separation of powers is the idea that the different powers of government, the different functions of the government, should be separated, should be distinguished between different branches of the government. We take that for granted in much of the West today, but historically, governments across time have not had such a clear distinction, such a clear separation of powers. So in olden times, you might have government, say, led by a king who is an executive leader, obviously, but also makes laws and interprets laws. In some countries, you had different courts, different parlements in France who had a mix of these different kinds of roles. So they weren't distinguished very clearly. But it was really the great 18th century French thinker, the Baron de Montesquieu, who articulated theoretically what the separation of powers ought to look like and why it ought to happen. And so the key phrase here is dividing power against itself. So he was a liberal like John Locke, and he believed that that the purpose of government is very limited, very specifically to ensuring the protection of rights. And so, like many liberals, his main concern is about the infringement of powers, of liberties, of people by the government. So he wanted to keep the government fairly limited. And one way is to separate the branches of government so they are divided against themselves, which we see all the time in US government. The main three branches are typically expressed as the executive, legislative, and judicial. And since this is a live video, of course, there's that quotation mark before the word executive that doesn't belong there. And this kind of way of analyzing branches of government will probably remind you of the traditionalism we talked about with our three approaches earlier in the semester, that it's a focus on the analysis of government according to how the constitutions lay out the government. So those three branches as found on paper documents. The separation of powers is related to, but distinct from, checks and balances. So in the United States, many of us know, and this is true for other countries too, that the different branches of the government have checks and balances against each other. So they have ways of limiting the authority of the other branches. So separation of powers is related to that idea, but not quite the same. For one thing, separation of powers is logically, conceptually prior to checks and balances. You could not have checks and balances between the different branches of government if you did not first separate those branches of government. So you can't really have an effective checks and balances unless you have a separation of powers in the first place. Second difference, if you think about it, checks and balances are a bit of a negation of the separation of powers. So the separation of powers means that each branch has its own power. But what checks and balances do are give branches of government a small amount of authority over the power of other branches. So, for instance, Congress writes bills and passes them, and then the president has to sign it into law. So while the separation of powers would say it's the primary task of the US Congress to write laws, checks and balances, that idea is going to say, well, but let's get the president a little bit involved in the legislation process, precisely to limit the power of the Congress that separation of powers gives it. So these are very simple ideas, but because they're so fundamental, it can be a bit confusing. So again, separation of powers is related to checks and balances, but not quite the same thing. When we're thinking, so we're moving on to topic 2 now. When we're thinking about relationships between the executive and the legislative, there are two broad systems that are basically different models of those executive legislative relations. The presidential system and the parliamentary system. So this is the bulk of the chapter and the bulk of our conversation, the differences between these two systems. A presidential system, as it suggests, has a president at its head. So the United States is a very obvious example of this. What's so important about a presidential system is it entails the separation of executive and legislative powers. So in a presidential system, the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches is very strong. And it's not just that they do different things, but it's also that they are selected in different ways and removed in different ways. So the executive and legislative offices are different elections. Now, they might happen on the same day, but you're not voting for the same people for the same offices. These are different people being elected for different offices. And it's an important aspect of presidential systems, we'll see more why in a minute, that they tend to have fixed terms. So in a presidential system, you'll elect a president for 4 or 6 years, and the legislative branch will typically have terms of 2 or 4 or 6 years. And so those are fixed. Those elections don't change. Another really important aspect to a presidential system is that the legislature can't remove the executive officer through votes of no confidence. So a vote of no confidence is basically a legislature voting that they have no confidence in the executive officer, which would typically trigger new elections. And so the executive would lose his or her office, or at least would not be guaranteed to remain in office. But in a presidential system, part of that strong separation of executive and legislative powers is that in general, the legislature has fairly limited powers to remove the executive from office. Parliamentary system is quite different. So we said a presidential system is characterized by the separation of executive and legislative powers. Parliamentary systems have a combination of those executive and legislative powers. That even though conceptually you can point out the distinct roles of the executive and legislative powers in a parliamentary system, but in fact they're often conducted by the same people. That sounds a bit abstract. What exactly do we mean? Well, what we mean is that generally speaking, in a parliamentary system, the voters will elect their legislative members, and then the legislature will select the executive leadership of the country. So the executive branch is kind of the governing committee of the legislature, the executive committee, if you like, of the legislature. So the legislature can remove the executive with a vote of no confidence in a parliamentary system, which typically triggers new elections. So this is a pretty different system, right? The presidential system is premised on a strong separation of powers. Parliamentary system, not so much. And again, this comes up in two different ways. Well, in a couple of different ways. For one thing, the voters are electing the legislative power that then is selecting the executive. So they're not separate elections, at least as far as the voters are concerned. But also, the executive branch is dependent upon the legislative branch for its power, for its term. Uh, and then finally, precisely because the executive branch is selected by the legislative branch does typically have strong powers to remove the executive when it is displeased with the actions of the executive branch. So that's a very different system. Again, not the same degree of separation of powers. So just to take a case study, in the United States example of executive legislative relations, it's clear that the US has a very strong presidential system. So the separation of executive and legislative powers, quite clear. The different elections and the legislature cannot remove the executive through votes of no confidence. To be a bit more specific, the presidency and the Congress are clearly quite distinct. And it's important to see, and this it might not seem like a very important point here. We'll see why this is important, but the president does appoint his or her own cabinet, so his or her own executive officers, but they are not in Congress. If sometimes they are members of Congress when he or she nominates them, but then they leave Congress. So the executive and legislative branches are quite separate. They're totally different groups of people. The elections are also distinct. So Congress has elections every 2 years because, as you know, every member of the House goes up for election every 2 years, and about a third of U.S. senators go up for election every 2 years because there are 100 senators serving 6-year terms. And the president goes up for election every 4 years. As a result, divided government is a common result. So it's quite possible for one political party, to control the Congress, another party to control the presidency, and of course, the Congress itself has been quite regularly split since around 1968. It's rare that one political party dominates the presidency and both chambers of Congress. And united government is not always so united. So it might be, for instance, that two or more branches are controlled by or two or more parts of branches are controlled by the same party, but that partisan unity can be weakened by institutional differences. So in 2020, it's quite clear, of course, that the U.S. Senate is controlled by the Republicans and the presidency by the Republicans. But the Senate and the presidency have not always cooperated very willingly, and they do have different policy priorities. That's important. Why is that important? It's important partially because in the United States, political parties are a very important part of how our constitutional system operates, even though political parties are not an express part of the U.S. Constitution at all. However, the separation of powers does mean that we allocate different powers of government to different branches of government. And so sometimes those branches of government come into conflict and don't always cooperate very strategically, even if they're controlled by the same party. So it's fascinating to see how these constitutional design features come into friction or even conflict with partisan issues. Anyway, I think it's really fun. And then the last part is the legislature cannot remove the executive through votes of no confidence. Instead, there has to be a process of impeachment, which we saw earlier this semester. I don't know if you remember that. That feels like a million years ago. But in a presidential system, as we've said, the legislature does not select the executive branch. And so the legislature has fairly limited powers to remove the president. And so, in the impeachment process, as you know, is a two-step process where the House of Representatives has to vote to impeach on articles of impeachment for the president, and then that leads to a trial in the U.S. Senate. So these are significant obstacles toward the removal of the president by the U.S. Congress. Um, so it is a difficult and rare process. So in effect, this really reinforces that the U.S. president, as in any presidential system, serves at the pleasure of the electorate, the voters, not Congress. And if people are unhappy with a president in a presidential system, the best route, or the most common route, clearly, is not to try to get him or her removed through the legislature, but through the vote, through elections. That doesn't mean impeachment shouldn't happen, but just as a matter of fact, it's more likely to happen through elections. Although in recent years, of course, presidents have pretty consistently served two terms, except for George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. So let's turn to our second case study, the British system, the United Kingdom. So it's important to see again in the parliamentary system, you've got a combination of executive and legislative powers. So the parliament, which is composed of two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, is closely fused with the prime minister. And the way that works is that the citizens vote for members of parliament, often abbreviated MPs, and then the majority party of parliament gets to select the prime minister. So in other words, the prime minister is voted on amongst the members of the parliament. So it makes sense, of course, that the majority party within the parliament would have the final say as to who that person was. Once the prime minister is selected, the prime minister will then select cabinet ministers in consultation with the party. So the British cabinet is different in important aspects from the American cabinet because, for one thing, those cabinet ministers are members of the legislative branch just as much as the prime minister is. So they're occupying dual roles. Another thing is that the cabinet ministers aren't so freely selected by the prime minister. That majority party, the majority coalition in parliament, put that prime minister in power quite directly. And so the cabinet ministers are, you could imagine, it will be determined by the kind of allegiances and obligations owed by the prime minister to members of his party in the parliament. So it's not unusual in British cabinets for there to be very awkward relationships between the cabinet and the prime minister because, hey, some of these people, he or she had just been attempting to take the prime ministership from him. And so finally, the legislature can also remove the executive with votes of no confidence. In the British system, it's generally understood that parliamentary elections happen at least every 5 years, at least once every 5 years. But they can happen more often, either because the prime minister decides that now is a good time to have an election. This is when his or her party is strong, so this is the time to strike. Or because it's triggered by a no confidence vote. So if the parliament is unhappy with the prime minister, which has happened fairly often in the past several years, then the parliament can have a no confidence vote, and if it passes, then new elections are triggered. So the important thing here really is that the prime minister serves at the pleasure of the parliament and only indirectly at the pleasure of the people. So this little graph is a little colorful, but it's a nice graphic of the relationship between voters and the branches, I hope. So on the left, the presidential system, you've got the voters, the big orange block, and in different processes, they elect on the left the executive branch, that's one set of elections, and on the right, a different branch, the executive. So those are very distinct processes, even if it happens on the same day, or even if it's on the same ballot. The parliamentary relationship is different because in this case, the voters, so again, this big orange block, are voting for the legislative branch. So they are voting for their individual members of parliament. Um, and then the legislative branch in a parliamentary system will then choose from among themselves a chief executive. So quite different systems of accountability. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but as you can imagine, there are all sorts of hybrids between presidentialism and parliamentary systems. And so, two basic models right here are semi-presidential and parliamentary republics. So, in a semi-presidential system, you have a president and a prime minister, where the prime minister tends to operate the daily business of government, and the president sets a broader agenda. This is an important hybrid because it's the French model. And so France diffused it throughout the Francophone world and former French colonies. And Russia also has this kind of system. Parliamentary republics are interesting in part because they're in some important countries: Germany, Italy, India, and Pakistan. And in a parliamentary republic, the president has a largely ceremonial role. So the president is the head of state, but little involvement in government. So a bit like in some constitutional monarchies, where, for instance, in the United Kingdom or in Scandinavia, a monarch is the head of state, but with little to no direct constitutional authority. And it's really the prime minister or the chancellor who runs the government from the legislature. So probably everybody knows that Germany has a chancellor, Angela Merkel, and the chancellor role basically means prime minister. But Germany also has a president who's the head of state, but clearly not nearly the direct authority of Angela Merkel. And so this is just a fun little map showing the differences. Two interesting things to note really is that the distinctions between presidential and parliamentary systems have a lot to do with history and have a lot to do with colonialism and imperialism. Because if you see on this map, it's quite clear that the British have diffused parliamentary democracy across the world in their former colonies. But the United States has had a really strong impact in the Western Hemisphere. So, in the wars of independence in the 19th century, many Latin American countries chose to adopt US style constitutions with presidential republics. And as you can see, however, from this map, an awful lot of the world is some kind of hybrid. So it's a lot more complex than just presidential or parliamentary. But part of why we want to study those two models is because they represent two really important and distinctive forms of how you relate the different branches of government, how far they are separated from one another. And that can help you clarify how other hybrid systems fall in between those two systems. Political scientists love to argue about which system is better, the presidential or the parliamentary, and they're quite different. So the presidential system really emphasizes strong executive leadership, partially because the president can claim the direct popular approval election of the people. Separation of powers and checks and balances are both strong. You have predictable election cycles. And at least in some cases, minority parties can still have a voice. Why? Because even if the minority party doesn't win the presidency, they can still have a role in Congress, the legislative system. Parliamentary system tends to emphasize the role of the legislature, and in the parliamentary system, it's often said the party leadership is stronger because the parties really shape who controls the legislature and thus who controls the executive branch. And that leads to clear lines of responsibility. It's quite clear that there is one party or one coalition in charge of the government. You don't have the divided government of presidential systems. And that leads, of course, to high coordination between executive and legislative branches. It's also easy to remove the executive if things aren't going well. And for some people, it's a plus that you have flexible elections. So, in the case of the British system, you're having elections at least once every 5 years, and sometimes more often as necessary. So you hear about the British government or the Italian government falling and being replaced, and that's all quite dramatic from a United States perspective, where we have government, that transition of power every 4 years. But in a parliamentary system, that's just how you do business. That ensures that the system works. Political scientists like parliamentary systems. They think that presidential systems are too rigid and lead to rival electoral mandates, so both the president and the legislature can claim the voice of the people. Presidential elections are definitely zero sum. Only one person can become president. And so there's a risk, people think, and this was argument made a lot in the 60s and 70s, that a presidential system, it can be easily captured by an authoritarian leader. So some kind of the president can become dictatorial and take control of the government. And this is a commonly made claim in Latin America, that presidential systems in Latin America and Africa have led to authoritarianism. Another important criticism is it's quite possible that the United States has been the only really successful presidential system. So the argument would go, the majority of successful, flourishing democracies around the world are parliamentary, and the US is the only presidential system. We're just going to move past this for now. The judiciary, the fifth part of this presentation, famously called the least dangerous branch by Alexander Hamilton in one of the Federalist Papers. And there's a sense there's been a sense in the past couple of centuries the judicial branch was by far the least powerful, because it had the power of neither a purse nor sword. So it's not in control of the military, it's not in control of money. But in the 20th and 21st century, the judicial branch, in many countries, has found ways to become important. So in the United States, the doctrine of judicial review is the idea that courts are the ultimate arbiter of constitutional interpretation. So what does the Constitution mean? And that's a pretty complex idea once you get into the weeds, because obviously the presidency and Congress, they both have a large role. They have to interpret the Constitution on a daily basis. In the United Kingdom, it's much weaker, the judicial branch, because it's generally understood that Parliament is the ultimate arbiter of the British Constitution. The British Constitution is not written, so it's just a vast, although some of it is, but as a whole, it's just a vast collection of precedents and customs and principles. So the British law is very different from Roman law. And that is it for this delightful presentation. I hope you found it delightful. I apologize that was a little on the long side, but I hope you found it helpful. And so good luck studying all this material, and let me know if you have any questions. Take care.